Ernest Shackleton had a restless spirit. He already knew the Antarctic well, having been there twice before, but his ambition burned brighter than ever. He wasn't content with just exploring. He wanted to do something no one had ever done. His grand vision was to be the first human to cross the entire Antarctic continent, pole to pole. This wasn't just a journey. It was a statement, a challenge to the last untamed frontier on Earth. He called his expedition the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, a name as big and bold as his plan. For this monumental task, he commissioned a ship, the Endurance. Its design was special, built to withstand the crushing ice of the polar seas, and its name, Endurance, was a promise and a premonition. Shackleton didn't pick just any crew. He had a unique way of doing things. He wasn't looking for the most experienced sailors necessarily, but for men with character, with grit, who could handle extreme pressure and stick together. He placed an advertisement that supposedly read, "Men wanted for hazardous journey. Small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful. Honor and recognition in case of success." Whether that exact ad was real or not, it captured the spirit of his selection process. His crew came from all walks of life: scientists, engineers, sailors, a doctor, a photographer. Each man had his own reasons for joining, a mix of adventure, scientific curiosity, and the desire to be part of history. Aboard the Endurance, an initial optimism filled the air. There was a sense of camaraderie, a shared excitement for the incredible journey ahead. They were a band of brothers, ready to face whatever the South threw at them. The Endurance set sail from Buenos Aires, leaving behind the last familiar sights of civilization. As they left the bustling port, the world they knew slowly faded into the horizon. Soon, the blue waters gave way to a darker, colder sea, and then the first ice floes appeared. Small at first, like scattered white petals on the water, they soon grew in number and size, a gradual immersion into the stark, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying Antarctic environment. The Weddell Sea, known for its treacherous ice, welcomed them with a mix of awe-inspiring beauty and subtle menace. The ice shimmered under the pale sun, creating a landscape unlike any other. Everything felt fresh, new, and full of possibility. However, it wasn't long before foreboding signs started to appear. The ice pack, even for the early season, was unusually severe. It was denser, more widespread than anticipated. The Endurance, despite its sturdy build, began to slow down. The going became tougher. What started as an adventure began to feel more like a struggle against an increasingly unyielding environment. The ship found itself pushing through thicker and thicker ice, sometimes stopping altogether. Subtle shifts in crew morale started to show. The initial high spirits began to temper, as the reality of their situation, the sheer power of the ice, began to sink in. Shackleton, ever the leader, tried his best to maintain spirits. He encouraged games, kept routines, and constantly looked for a way out, hoping to find a clear path through the frozen maze. But the ice tightened its grip, slowly, relentlessly, making its intentions clear. They were entering a world where nature truly ruled. The subtle menace of the Weddell Sea soon turned into an inescapable prison. One morning, the Endurance found itself completely surrounded. The ice had closed in, locking the ship in a solid, unyielding embrace. This was the definitive moment of entrapment. They were stuck. Shackleton and his men tried everything they could think of to free the ship. They used saws, cutting channels in the ice, hoping to create a path. They even tried small dynamite charges, attempting to blast their way through the thick floes. But all their efforts were futile. The ice was too vast, too powerful. They soon realized they were at the mercy of this frozen world, a tiny wooden vessel held captive by an immense, indifferent force. With the ship no longer moving, life aboard the frozen vessel took on a new, strange rhythm. Shackleton, with his characteristic pragmatism, immediately set about establishing routines. Discipline was key to survival and maintaining order. The crew settled into a kind of static existence, surrounded by an endless white expanse that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The psychological impact of this new reality was profound. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. The ship, once a symbol of adventure and progress, became their stationary home, a small island of wood and steel in a sea of ice. Shackleton's leadership shone through as he adapted to this new reality. He fostered resilience, encouraging the men to keep busy, to maintain a sense of purpose, even as their grand expedition lay frozen in place. He understood that idleness was the enemy of morale. But even with routines and stern leadership, the environment was relentless. The ice began to exert immense pressure on the Endurance's hull. It wasn't a sudden, violent assault, but a slow, grinding force. The ship, designed to withstand such forces, began to show signs of strain. Audible stresses filled the air. The constant creaking and groaning of timbers, the sharp reports as ice shifted and squeezed. These sounds created a constant tension among the crew. Every new noise, every shudder of the ship, brought a fresh wave of apprehension. They knew the Endurance was strong, but they also knew the ice was stronger, an almost living entity that was slowly, inexorably tightening its grip. Each compression was a reminder of their precarious situation, a test of the ship's endurance against the brute force of nature. Then came the inevitable. On October 27, 1915, the ice finally breached the Endurance's hull. It was a dramatic moment, not of explosive impact, but of a slow, agonizing surrender. Water began to pour into the ship. The frantic efforts to save supplies and equipment began immediately. Men worked tirelessly, racing against time as their home and lifeline slowly succumbed to the frigid water. They salvaged what they could: food, tools, clothing, the 3 lifeboats, anything that might aid their survival. The emotional impact was heavy. Watching their ship, the vessel that had carried their hopes and dreams, slowly sink beneath the ice was devastating. It wasn't just a ship. It was their connection to the world, their only real shelter in this hostile environment. As the Endurance finally disappeared from view, leaving only a dark hole in the ice, a profound sense of loss settled over the crew. They were truly alone now, stranded on a vast, desolate expanse of ice, with nothing but their wits and each other to rely on. The reality of their predicament was stark and terrifying. The crew abandoned ship, stepping onto the unforgiving surface of the ice. This was the stark reality of their new existence, a vast white canvas stretching endlessly in every direction. They immediately set about establishing Ocean Camp, a makeshift refuge on the ice floe. Salvaging what they could from the sinking Endurance was their first priority. Food, sleeping bags, cooking gear, and the 3 lifeboats were pulled clear, each item a precious commodity in this desolate landscape. The immediate challenges were immense. The extreme cold bit deep, shelter was minimal, and the psychological shock of losing their ship weighed heavily on everyone. Shackleton, ever the pragmatist, pushed them to work, to build, to focus on the next step, knowing that action was the best antidote to despair. Soon, a new, unsettling realization dawned on them. Their ice floe was not static. It was slowly, steadily, drifting northward with the currents. This meant they were moving, but without any control over their direction or speed. The constant uncertainty of their journey became another layer of stress. Days turned into weeks, then months, as they became unwilling passengers on a giant frozen raft. The endless expanse of ice and sky offered a monotonous and desolate landscape, broken only by the occasional pressure ridge or the dark, open leads of water that sometimes appeared. Every sunrise brought the same view. Every sunset, the same chill. Life at Ocean Camp was a constant struggle for survival and morale. Supplies, though carefully rationed, were finite. They hunted seals and penguins for food, their blubber providing precious fuel for their small stoves. The daily grind of maintaining camp was brutal. Frostbite was a constant threat and hypothermia a daily battle. Shackleton understood the importance of keeping spirits up. He encouraged games, storytelling, and assigned tasks to keep everyone occupied, to give them a sense of purpose beyond simply existing. He would walk among the men, talking, listening, offering words of encouragement, always trying to gauge the mood and prevent any cracks in their collective resolve. He knew that physical survival depended on mental fortitude. Despite Shackleton's best efforts, the unraveling of hope was an undeniable force. The psychological toll of prolonged isolation began to show. The lack of progress, the sheer vastness of the Southern Ocean surrounding them, chipped away at their optimism. They were so far from any known shipping lanes, so far from any chance of rescue. The distance separating them from civilization felt immeasurable. Shackleton, too, fought an internal battle. He had to maintain an outward appearance of unwavering resolve, even as the enormity of their situation pressed down on him. He knew his men looked to him for strength, and he could not afford to show any weakness. He carried the burden of their lives, a responsibility that must have felt crushing at times. He pushed himself, and them, onward, always searching for a glimmer of hope in the endless white. The ice, their temporary home, was slowly but surely breaking up beneath their feet, threatening to cast them adrift into the frigid waters once more. They had to move, and soon. The ice was groaning, cracking, and their time on the floe was coming to an end. The groaning and cracking of the ice became more frequent, more violent. One morning, with a sound like thunder, their large, relatively stable ice floe, their ocean camp, suddenly disintegrated. It wasn't a slow break, it was a dramatic, sudden fracturing that sent shockwaves through the camp. Men scrambled, shouting, grabbing what they could as the ground beneath them shifted and split. They were forced to relocate to smaller, less stable floes, each one a precarious raft in a sea of slush and broken ice. This constant, immediate danger meant that every step had to be calculated, every move deliberate. The threat of falling into the frigid water was ever present, a chilling reminder of how quickly their situation could worsen. They moved from one temporary haven to another, each smaller and more vulnerable than the last, until it became clear that staying on the ice was no longer an option. Shackleton knew this was the moment. He made the critical decision to launch their 3 salvaged lifeboats into the open water. This was a desperate gamble. These were small boats, built for ship-to-shore transfers, not for the open ocean, yet they were their only hope. The immense challenge of navigating through broken ice and heavy seas was immediate. The men, already exhausted from months on the ice, now faced the grueling task of rowing and sailing in conditions that would test even the most seasoned sailors. The physical and mental exhaustion was profound. Every stroke of the oar, every adjustment of the sail, was a testament to their will to survive. The ordeal at sea began immediately. They were battling storms, high waves that seemed to swallow their tiny boats whole, and freezing spray that coated everything in a layer of ice. The constant struggle against hypothermia and dehydration was brutal. Their clothes were perpetually damp, their skin chapped and raw from the salt and cold. The conditions in the open boats were cramped and miserable. There was no real shelter, no way to escape the biting winds or the relentless spray. They huddled together for warmth, sharing what little food and water they had, their bodies aching from the constant movement and the strain of rowing. Sleep was a luxury, stolen in short, fitful bursts, often interrupted by the need to bail water or adjust course. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of cold, hunger, and relentless effort. They pushed themselves past what they thought were their limits, then found new reserves of strength. Shackleton moved between the boats, offering encouragement, making sure everyone was still fighting. He knew that if one man gave up, the others might follow. He kept their destination, Elephant Island, in their minds, a distant speck of hope in the vast, unforgiving ocean. Despite the suffering, the men kept going, driven by the slim chance of land, a place where they might finally escape the immediate threat of the sea. Then, after what felt like an eternity, came the emotional moment of spotting land. It was a faint outline on the horizon, barely visible through the mist and spray. But it was there, Elephant Island. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost brought some men to tears, washed over them. They had been adrift for days, believing they might never see solid ground again. The sight of land, any land, was a miracle, but the fight wasn't over. The final desperate push to reach the rocky, inhospitable shore was still ahead. The currents were strong, the waves still high, and the coast looked forbidding. They rowed with renewed vigor, every muscle screaming in protest, until finally their boats scraped against the shingle. They had made it. They stumbled onto the shore, collapsing from exhaustion, their bodies trembling from cold and relief. The immediate joy of being on land was overwhelming, but it was quickly followed by the dawning realization of their new predicament. Elephant Island was not a paradise. It was a barren, desolate rock, far from any shipping lanes and completely uninhabited. They had survived the immediate peril of the sea, but they were still stranded, still isolated. with no apparent way home. Their survival was a testament to their resilience, but the biggest challenge, the journey to rescue, still lay ahead. The harsh reality of Elephant Island quickly set in. It was barren, a desolate rock with no fresh water sources, and no hope of finding food beyond what they could hunt. This was not a place for long-term survival, and certainly not a place where rescue would just happen upon them. The temporary refuge they found allowed them to rest their weary bodies, but their minds were still racing with the desperate situation. The crew's growing despair was palpable. They understood their remote location. Far from any shipping lanes and the immense distance from civilization. They had escaped the sea, only to find themselves trapped on a different kind of prison. Shackleton, ever the pragmatist, knew they couldn't stay. He gathered his men and laid out an audacious proposal, one that seemed almost insane. He suggested they take one of the lifeboats, the sturdiest one they had, and sail 800 miles across the notoriously rough Southern Ocean to South Georgia. This was not just dangerous. It was a suicide mission. The inherent dangers were immense. The world's roughest ocean, rudimentary navigation, with only a sextant and a chronometer, and limited supplies that would barely last the projected journey. He needed volunteers, men of exceptional courage and skill, who understood the odds but were willing to face them. Frank Worsley, their skilled navigator, was an obvious choice. Tom Crean, a veteran of Antarctic expeditions, was another. 4 others were chosen, each handpicked for their strength, resilience, and unwavering loyalty. The task of preparing the chosen lifeboat, the James Caird, fell mainly to the ship's carpenter, Harry McNish. McNish, despite his earlier insubordination, proved invaluable. He ingeniously modified the small boat, raising its sides with canvas and wood from other salvage boats, and building a makeshift deck to offer some protection from the waves. They meticulously packed essential supplies, food, biscuits, water, and fuel for their small blubber stove. Worsley carefully checked his navigation tools, knowing their lives depended on his precision. Every detail mattered, every knot, every piece of canvas, every ration. The emotional farewell to the remaining men on Elephant Island was heavy with unspoken fears. There was no guarantee of return, no certainty that this desperate gamble would pay off. Shackleton promised he would come back for them, a promise he intended to keep no matter the cost. On April 24, 1916, the James Caird was launched into the icy waters. It was a tiny speck against the vast grey ocean, dwarfed by the towering waves. Shackleton and his small crew pushed off, leaving behind 22 men who watched their only hope disappear into the horizon. The immense psychological burden on Shackleton and his men was immediate. They were undertaking a journey that had never been attempted, in conditions that defied belief. The dawning realization that this was their only chance, a suicide mission as some had called it, settled deep within them. There was no turning back. Their lives, and the lives of the men left behind, depended entirely on their success. They sailed into the unknown, a tiny wooden boat against the fury of the Southern Ocean, carrying the hopes of all their comrades. Every gust of wind, every spray of water, was a stark reminder of the monumental task ahead. They were literally putting everything on the line. The James Caird immediately plunged into the brutal reality of the Southern Ocean. They were sailing directly into the roaring 40s and furious 50s, notorious for their monstrous waves and gale-force winds. The tiny boat was tossed around like a toy, constantly battered by towering swells that seemed to come from every direction. Water poured over the makeshift deck, forcing the men into a relentless cycle of bailing. Every spare moment was spent scooping icy water out of the boat, a fight to keep it from sinking. The physical toll was immediate and severe. Their clothes were constantly soaked, leading to frostbite on hands and feet. Salt sores appeared on their skin from the constant dampness and friction. Sleep was almost impossible, snatched in short, uncomfortable bursts while crammed together in the cramped space. Hunger became a dull ache, never fully satisfied by their meager rations. Navigation in such conditions was a miracle, a testament to Frank Worsley's incredible skill. He had to take sightings of the sun or stars, often through breaks in the clouds, while the boat pitched and rolled violently. Imagine trying to hold a sextant steady on a bucking bronco in a blizzard. Missing a sighting meant they could be blown hundreds of miles off course, a death sentence in that vast ocean. Each observation was a triumph, a tiny victory against overwhelming odds. Shackleton trusted Worsley completely, a trust that was well placed. The constant threat of capsizing was ever present, especially when the boat was broadsided by a particularly large wave. One moment stands out, a near catastrophe that almost ended their journey. A colossal rogue wave, which Shackleton later described as a greybeard, rose out of the ocean, a liquid mountain that seemed to block out the sky. It crashed down on the James Caird, burying the boat completely. For a terrifying moment, the men were underwater, a mixture of fear and cold washing over them. When the boat resurfaced, miraculously still intact, it was half filled with water. They bailed frantically, their hearts pounding, knowing how close they had come to the end. The ice buildup on the boat was another constant danger. Freezing spray laminated the boat in layers of ice, making it heavy and unstable. They had to chip it away constantly, a dangerous task carried out in the dark and cold, risking their fingers and their lives. Shackleton's leadership was the anchor that kept them from drifting into despair. He maintained a strict routine, even in those impossible conditions. He insisted on hot meals, however small, cooked on their blubber stove, knowing the psychological boost it provided. He distributed their rum rations carefully, using them not just for warmth, but as a morale booster. He kept talking to his men, sharing his own strength, making sure no one gave up. He knew that if one man lost hope, it could spread like a disease. He rationed every drop of fresh water, even when they were parched, understanding that discipline was key to survival. The psychological gauntlet they ran was almost as brutal as the physical one. The profound isolation of being a tiny wooden speck in the middle of the world's largest ocean was immense. The vastness of the sea, the endless horizon, made them feel utterly insignificant. There were times when the men fought despair, when the cold and hunger blurred the lines between reality and hallucination. They saw things that weren't there, heard sounds that were just the wind and waves. Shackleton himself battled his own demons, his own fears, but he never let it show. He knew his men were watching him, and his unwavering resolve was their greatest source of strength. He had promised to get them home, and that promise, more than anything else, kept him going, pushing him through every moment of doubt and pain. He had to keep going for his men, for the lives that depended solely on his will. After 16 brutal days on the ocean, battling storms and the constant threat of death, a cry went up from the James Caird. Land! It was South Georgia, a jagged outline against the grey sky. The sight brought an overwhelming wave of relief, a raw, primal joy that washed over the exhausted men. They had somehow made it against all odds. But their ordeal was far from over. The island, while a beacon of hope, also presented a new set of challenges. The western coast, where they had made landfall, was a wall of sheer cliffs and glaciers, battered by heavy surf. There was no safe harbor, no easy landing. They were forced to skirt the treacherous coast, searching for any break in the imposing barrier. They finally managed to anchor the James Caird in a small exposed cove. It was a temporary reprieve, but not a solution. They were still stranded, exhausted and exposed to the elements. The whalers' station, their ultimate destination, was on the other side of the island, separated by a formidable range of uncharted mountains and glaciers. The realization hit them hard. They had survived the most dangerous boat journey in history, only to be faced with another seemingly impossible task. The men were too weak for another sea journey around the island. Their options were dwindling, and despair, which had been held at bay by the immediate goal of reaching land, started to creep back in. Shackleton, ever the pragmatist, knew they couldn't stay in the cove. The James Caird was not built for prolonged shelter, and they were still at the mercy of the sea. He made a decision that was as bold as it was desperate. They would traverse the interior of South Georgia. This had never been done before. The island was a wilderness of ice, snow, and rock, with no maps of its interior. They had no climbing gear, no specialized equipment, just their worn clothes and whatever they could carry. It was an insane plan, a suicide mission within a suicide mission, but it was their only real chance. Shackleton chose 2 men to accompany him on this perilous trek: Frank Worsley, their incredible navigator, and Tom Crean, a tough, dependable Irishman who had proven his mettle countless times. The 3 of them would attempt to cross the island, leaving the other 3 men incapacitated by frostbite and exhaustion to wait in the James Caird. It was a heartbreaking decision, but necessary. They fashioned crude crampons from screws from the boat, and Frank Wilde, who would remain with the others, made them a makeshift rope from the boat's rigging. They packed a small stove, some food, and a carpenter's adze which would serve as their ice axe. Shackleton gave strict instructions to Wilde. If they hadn't returned in a specified number of days, he was to try and make his way around the island by sea to get help. On May 19, 1916, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean began their epic mountain crossing. They started their climb through blinding fog and driving snow. The terrain was brutal: steep, icy slopes, hidden crevasses, and towering peaks. With no maps, Worsley relied on instincts and occasional glimpses of the sun through the clouds to keep them generally headed east. They pushed themselves beyond anything humanly thought possible. They slipped and fell, caught themselves on the makeshift rope, and pulled each other up again and again. Their clothes were soaked, their bodies aching, but they couldn't stop. To rest was to freeze to death. They climbed for what felt like an eternity, sometimes sliding down glaciers on their backsides, sometimes cutting steps in the ice with their adze. They went without sleep for 36 hours, a non-stop ordeal of sheer willpower. At one point, they were so close to collapse that Shackleton made them stop for 5 minutes, setting an alarm for each man to ensure they didn't fall into a fatal sleep. They battled thirst, chewing on snow, and the constant threat of disorientation in the whiteout conditions. It was a testament to human endurance, a journey that pushed them to the absolute limits of their physical and mental strength. They were driven by the knowledge that the lives of the men left behind on the James Caird and the men on Elephant Island depended entirely on their success. Then, through a break in the clouds, they heard it, the faint sound of a whaling station's whistle. It was a sound of civilization, a sound they hadn't heard in nearly 2 years. They stumbled down the last slopes, their bodies screaming in protest, driven only by the hope of rescue. They reached the outskirts of Stromness whaling station, looking like ghosts, disheveled, frostbitten, and utterly spent. The whalers who saw them emerge from the wilderness were stunned. They couldn't believe their eyes. These were not men who had come from a ship. These were men who had defied the impossible. When Shackleton finally spoke his name, the recognition dawned, and the whalers, many of whom knew him, rushed to help. It was an emotional scene, a mixture of shock, relief, and profound disbelief that anyone could have survived such an ordeal. They were given food, warmth, and a chance to rest, but Shackleton's mind was already racing, focused on one thing: the men he had left behind. His immediate priority was to rescue the men still on the James Caird, waiting on the uninhabited side of South Georgia. He quickly organized a relief party, and within hours, they sailed around the island to pick up the remaining 3 weary sailors. That reunion was just as emotional, a testament to the bonds forged in extreme adversity. But the true mission remained, the 22 men still marooned on Elephant Island. This, Shackleton knew, would be even harder. He needed a suitable ship, one that could brave the treacherous Antarctic waters. His first attempt, using a small whaling vessel, was thwarted by impassable ice. He tried again with a larger ship, the Instituto de Pesca No. 11, loaned by the Uruguayan government. But again, the ice refused to yield. Each failed attempt was an agonizing blow, not just to Shackleton, but to the men waiting, unaware of the efforts being made on their behalf. The delays stretched into months, and Shackleton felt the weight of his promise to bring every man home pressing down on him. He couldn't rest, couldn't truly recover, until every single one of his crew was safe. Finally, after 3 failed attempts, he secured the Yelcho, a small Chilean steam tug, whose captain Luis Pardo bravely volunteered for the perilous journey. On August 30th, 1916, Shackleton and his small rescue party once again set sail for Elephant Island. The tension on board was palpable. Would the men still be alive? Would the ice allow them through this time? As they approached the island, a thick fog shrouded the landscape, making navigation difficult. Then, as if by miracle, the fog lifted, revealing the desolate, snow-covered shores of Elephant Island. And there they were. The men, huddled near their makeshift shelter, saw the ship approaching. A cheer erupted, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy and relief that echoed across the barren landscape. Shackleton, binoculars pressed to his eyes, counted every man. All 22 were there. He kept his promise. The Yelcho pulled alongside, and the emaciated, frost-bitten survivors scrambled aboard, tears streaming down their faces. The reunion was overwhelming, a cacophony of shouts, laughter, and embraces. They were safe. All of them. Shackleton's leadership throughout the entire ordeal became legendary. He had started with a grand ambition to cross Antarctica, a goal that ultimately failed. But in that failure he achieved something far greater. He brought every single one of his men home alive against all odds. His resilience, his unwavering commitment to his crew, his ability to inspire hope in the darkest of times, and his sheer courage became the hallmarks of his enduring legacy. The story of the Endurance and the James Caird is not just a tale of survival, it's an inspiration, a testament to the triumph of the human spirit against the most brutal forces of nature, proving that even when plans fall apart, true leadership can forge an unforgettable path to victory.